Hey everybody, this is Rydo and we're back to Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel. Let's hop in. So over the weekend, for the accountability section, I had this zit or something deep at like the lowest level of my skin, right on my eyebrow. And so I was in a lot of really distracting pain, not like horrifically terrible pain, but enough that it was causing me to squint. It was distracting me, causing me to lose my train of thought even more than I normally lose my train of thought, which are honestly I'm not too good at that in the first place. I'm still wondering if these dual lives, if you can have multiple of them or any of them backlogged, or if you have to accept the dual live and claim it completely. I'm not sure. So with that going on, even on Friday, and I guess there's really no reason here in Yu-Gi-Oh! to do anything. I mean, you can look at the cards and pretend like you know what they are, but it doesn't really help too much to look at the cards unless you can actually spend the time to read all the cards or you can recognize the cards. So when you see things like Monster Reborn, of course everybody knows what Monster Reborn does, but when you see things like Draco back the Rideable Dragon, I have no idea what that spell does, nor do I want to read this wall of text to try and figure it out now when I'm just going to have to play with the cards to figure out what they do anyways. And looking at this deck, I can see that this loner deck has maybe 20% at most of cards that I recognize, which is only a sparse indicator of my general understanding of Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards. So anyways, I've been out of it since Friday as far as making pre-recorded footage, which isn't to say that I've been out of it as far as playing video games. I did start playing Zelda Breath of the Wild, which I have to say is a very weird Zelda game. It's oddly very Chinese, in that instead of having dungeons, I don't think there are any dungeons at all. If there are dungeons in the game, they must be halfway through the game, and I would suspect there's 4 at most. And that the 4 divine beasts that you have to subdue turn out to be dungeons at best. But the vast majority of what dungeons are have become shrines, and in these shrines are these mummified 100-year-old what look like Buddhist monks or Shinto monks. I would go probably more Buddhist than anything, and they're doing different poses that feel like Buddhist, like yoga style poses. And in most of the shrines I've seen, there is a puzzle to in most of the shrines I've seen, there's a puzzle that you activate to get to the end, and at the end they give you a soul sphere, and then turning the soul sphere in, turning 4 of the soul spheres into one of many shrines in the giant overworld of Breath of the Wild lets you either increase your health or increase your stamina. And now I kind of know, having some of it spoiled to me, that you probably want stamina way more than you want health. But there is a certain point after getting a full second ring, which took about 5 stamina increases, that I've just been dying a ton. Like I'm probably up to the 50th or 60th game over Which for a Nintendo game, that seems pretty much insane that you would be that high on game overs. And even for a Zelda game. So, yeah, because you have the ability to use armor to increase your defense, having 3 hearts with a lot of armor actually changes a lot of things, because it's not like a specific enemy does a specific amount of damage every time. You're not gonna find a goblin creature that always does a quarter of a heart or half of a heart. No, in some parts of the world, the map, the characters you're fighting are just gonna hit for 25, 100 potential. I wouldn't suspect it's actually 100. I would suspect it's probably closer to 25 damage. And then at the early beginning of the games, you'll have things that are just going to be hitting for like 1 damage. And if I assume the way it works is if they're hitting for 100 damage and then you have 20% or 21 armor, then you probably are subtracting the 21 from the 100 and then taking the rest as damage. Although, if that were true, then you would need a lot more hearts than the 3 hearts, so that's probably not exactly the right numbers in that process. But my main point there is that you can effectively increase your defense with unbreakable armor, or what seems like unbreakable armor. You can also increase your defense with breakable shields, which is an odd system. And then you also attack with breakable weapons, which is an insane system. There's just no value in it. Plus, there isn't an infinite number of weapons, particularly good weapons, in the game. There definitely is a scenario, if I goof around too much, where I will break all of the good weapons and end up only being able to use some fairly low-level basic weapons that you can somewhat recoup. It feels like there's just an insane amount of experimentation that was done on Breath of the Wild, and it highlights how Nintendo really has just dropped the ball as far as making any kind of open world RPG. And if you told me that Breath of the Wild originally started as an open world RPG that had nothing to do with Zelda, I'd kind of believe you, because it doesn't really feel like a Zelda game in any means. It doesn't really feel like there's that much of a narrative to it, and it definitely doesn't feel like it's sticking to the original core concepts of there being special weapons that give you special abilities that that then let you get further to other dungeons. Like, Zelda games, you're supposed to go to one dungeon to get an item that would be a special ability item that would let you go to the next dungeon and let you use that next item. It doesn't really feel like there's too much of that going on. There might be one special item that you have to get to each of the 4 divine beasts, but I'm not even sure that means you get to keep that item, or if that's more just like a key that you're giving to other characters. So I'm very confused and not really liking the experience of the Breath of the Wild as much as I should be. Like, there's absolutely just a weirdness to it that shouldn't be there. There are little tweaks, certainly, that would have improved it. First of all, you just need to cut some of the fat. You oddly don't pick up rubies anywhere as often as you normally would. In fact, only very rarely do I find rubies at all. And I played for 4 or 5 hours, it feels like. It probably wasn't that long. It was probably 3 hours before I even saw a ruby or saw mention of a ruby. So at first it feels like the game is just not going to have that. There's a way too much emphasis on the cooking system, and I really don't want to engage with the cooking system. I would rather just be able to buy potions with rupees and get a lot more rupees. There's a lot of expensive stuff in the stores, and the only thing I could suggest to people is it does seem like a lot of the outfits can be found or earned. A lot of the accessories and outfits really have a much higher value than anything else. Ingredients don't need to really be bought in shops. Outfits probably don't need to be bought in shops. There are fairies, but I've still yet to figure out how to capture one. Either you have to run up to them very fast and grab them, or you need a bottle or a bag or something, some item that I just haven't found. And a lot of my confusion certainly comes around the fact that there's just a lot of lack of hand-holding in this game. Like when you first start the game, you're in this kind of smaller section, and in the smaller section you can't go any further until you've done the first 4 shrines, because you're up in this raised area and you'll just fall to your death if you tried to climb down or jump down. The world clearly plays with height way more, and that's why stamina is so important. Is that you'd be shocked how valuable it is to be able to climb a little bit further in the area, or fall a little bit lower in an area and then recover from the going deeper. Also, coldness is a factor, which the environmental, this is too cold, you need to wear something that resists cold, is another system that should have been left on the cutting room floor. The game really is just full of systems and ideas and experiments versus a fully thought out game. So early in that first section, there is a cold area that that you can't reach without some cold resistance. How do you get cold resistance? Well, the guy tells you to find cooking ingredients and cook this special recipe for him, and doesn't give you the full recipe, just kind of hints at it, and then he would have given you a special shirt that could have had cold resistance. But since I didn't have the ingredients for that, or didn't cook it right, instead I just made a recipe for something different, because the recipe system is actually fairly easier to cook with than it would seem at first. It's fairly easy to figure out. There's food that you can cook 2 pieces of, and really should just cook 2 pieces to start with, because your 3 hearts are not going to benefit it from something that you use 3 pieces, 4 pieces, or 5 pieces, because that's going to just increase the health to such a high level that that it's going to be wasteful. So if you find 2 apples and you cook an apple and a mushroom, you'll get a recipe. If you find 2 apples and cook them together, you'll get a different recipe. Food and certain spices like acorns or salt will increase it, and really you should lean fairly heavily on apples, and if you have salted apples, I think would probably work too, but maybe save the salt for later, for more expensive or rare items. But that's pretty much all you do. And then there's a whole second couple of categories of monster parts, which are things you get after defeating monsters, which you can't really do. There's no real value in fighting a lot of the monsters unless there's a monster chest that they're protecting, and the monster chests only unlock when you defeat an entire small group of monsters. Otherwise, you should just kind of run away from them, because you will damage your weapon fighting them, and you won't get a better weapon after a certain point. So the whole system is ridiculously flawed in its concept. Yeah. Because the weapons breaking discourages you from playing Breath of the Wild. If you fix that and just removed and modded out the weapons breaking and did no other changes, it would be a considerably better game. You just don't need that durability system, particularly since it doesn't feel like it's a fleshed out durability system where you can repair or increase the durability of any weapons. So at some point in this game, I more than likely will get the Master Sword, and the Master Sword will either break but not really break, or just straight up break, which the Master Sword obviously should not break. But yeah, you get rid of that one element, and you probably solve half of the problems of Zelda. So anyways, in this first area, you go through these first 4 shrines, and then it tells you to go far to the east of the map, and just try and talk to people. Actually, it kind of tells you to go to the middle to the east of the map, and then from the middle of the east of the map, it eventually points you far to the east of the map, and then from that point, that's when it starts to kind of go in an insane direction, because after you've done a certain amount of stuff, it just tells you to go to the 4 corners of the map and give up. Give up having any linear experience at all. I'm doomed. But part of the problem too is when it gets you to the far to the east part of the map, it also tells you to go to the far to the north part of the map, where the far to the north part of the map is I'm thinking possibly one of the most difficult locations to reach, and one of the most difficult locations to actually fight people. So why it tells you to go there that quickly doesn't make a lot of sense. The entire overworld, even the starting section, is littered with these robotic creatures called guardians that you certainly saw in the trailers of Breath of the Wild. And they are incredibly difficult at the beginning to defeat. And some of them maybe you can sneak behind. I will say some of them, if they are stuck in the ground and just lasering you from one position, might not be able to turn their head. I did find one that was like that. So I wouldn't be surprised if there is a certain level where that is the case. But otherwise, you are really gonna just die, and that's another point where the game overs don't start racking up, is that you will have a very high number of deaths, and it's not like the game checkpoints enough to justify these game overs. It checkpoints almost enough, but not quite. There definitely have been times where I've died and then I've lost a lot of progress, particularly when you get down to the photography system, which is just awful in Breath of the Wild. Because they really just wanted to show off in Breath of the Wild the Sheikah slate, which is supposed to be like a Nintendo Switch, but obviously it is something that was developed before the Nintendo Switch's design was finalized, because the Sheikah slate has like a handle grip on one side and seemingly was going to have a camera in it, and it's probably better that the Nintendo Switch doesn't have a camera, but yeah, there are just a lack of connections between what the Switch looks like and what the Sheikah slate looks like. The way it plugs into the docking stations in Breath of the Wild is not the way the Switch plugs in. But they do introduce this photography element, and when you take a picture of an item, you can then set the sensor in the Sheikah slate to look for that item. But I really have to question, if you set it to find a specific weapon, if you'll be able to find more than 4 or 5 of those weapons in the entire world. That definitely feels like that could be the case. The overworld is a lot of empty space. It is a ton of empty space. And part of that is because there's horses, and they wanted the horsing riding aspect in the game, which is just throwing another thing at the window. Horse riding has never been particularly good in video games. In fact, I named the horse Roach, just like in Witcher 3, for that very reason. It forces you to name the horse from blank. It doesn't even have a default name, although you can't name Link. Link is Link, Zelda is Zelda, and you can't change those names even if you wanted to. But yeah, making a giant overworld that barely has anything in it so you can have horses running around is really just chasing your own tail with bad idea after bad idea. Whereas the amount of grass they're rendering isn't really worth it. They could have made the world a little bit smaller, scale it down to like 0.8 times its current size, and just remove one step from point A to point B everywhere. Would have been the beginnings of a decent idea, certainly. Like, the stamina system, as far as running around, doesn't matter, because your stamina regenerates as soon as you stand still anywhere. So having a run is not really necessary, and compared to just having smaller areas and just more crammed together sections. Some of the shrines require you to use motion control, and those are nightmares because I'm using a Xbox adapter that doesn't have motion control, so then I have to bring back the Joy-Con, and even using the Joy-Con, the motion control is a nightmare. It just does not work for me at all. Like I spent 20 minutes trying to solve a shrine with motion control. Now the good news is that doesn't happen that often. I've only run into maybe 2 shrines out of, I would imagine, I'm close to 30 shrines now. I suspect that there's probably 100 shrines. There's also 100 just points of interest where you get these golden poops. If you find something out of place visually and you move things around so it visually does look in place. The most common one of that is if you find a rock on the top of a mountain and you pick up the rock, then it will recognize that and give you a golden poop. I think there's 100 of them. I don't think there's 1,000 of them. And I know you just get like a golden poop hat for doing it, so there's just no reward at all for actually doing that. Whereas your ability to spot mistakes or visual glitches in the world should be rewarded with something a lot better. There definitely is a scenario here where if you'd gotten all 100 of the Kokoro seeds, I think is what they're actually called, that you then could have no durability. Your weapons will never break. Your shields will never break, your bows will never break, your arrows will never break. You do find several different kinds of arrows, but they're extremely rare. So the only kinds of arrows you actually will use are regular arrows. And on top of that, you will break your bows every time you shoot a arrow. In fact, you break your bows incredibly fast, which is just insane. Every time you shoot an arrow, whether you hit something or you don't with the bow, just pulling the string seems to lower the durability. So there's definitely a broken system there. Broken system finding the Kokoro seeds, broken system with the durability. You could easily fix these things, but it seems like whoever worked on this Zelda game was a new person in charge because they wanted to tell a very different system. It inherently in the story does not feel like a Japanese story, and it does not feel like a Zelda story in particular. It feels like it is more of a Chinese Buddhist Tibetan like story. And that's not just because of the enshrined Buddhist monks holding the soul stones at the end of each shrine, but also in the fact that Calamity Ganon is not like this giant pig monster that he's been depicted as before, or more traditional, more recently in like Ocarina of Time, if you call that more recently. Ganon has just been depicted as a humanoid bad guy, and the turning into a monster is a secondary fact. In Breath of the Wild, Calamity Ganon definitely looks like a giant dragon. And Zelda games have never really been set in a highly technologically advanced world. It has definitely been more fantasy and more magic of a world, so you're inherently breaking the theme of Zelda when you add technology to the world. It just is not what Zelda has ever been. Zelda in Wind Waker is set hundreds, thousands of years in the future and in a flooded world. Is there any real technology in that world? No, it's small islands still doing mostly magical, mostly basic things. When you have weapons that or machines that can shoot lasers at you and do massive amounts of damage, then it brings down the question: is why are you using bows and arrows? Why isn't this guns? Like, inherently, guns and laser guns should be the default weapon in the world of Breath of the Wild. Like, you don't build a giant autonomous robot with laser eyes without first building a laser gun or a laser cannon, something. Now, there are obviously worse ways you could have brought in technology. It could have been a giant city that was just overfilling with skyscrapers and felt a lot more like Blade Runner than anything else. It could have been dark. There could have been entire dungeons with technology and robots crawling around. But the technology existing at all, I think, is part of the problem. It really should be heavily magic, because the entire Zelda series has been heavily around magic, and even in Breath of the Wild, they're talking about the goddess Hylia, so it's still hanging around three goddesses making the Triforce of Power, Wisdom, and Courage. And I assume at some level Link has still got the Triforce of Courage, where Zelda has the Triforce of Wisdom, and Ganon should still have the Triforce of Power. Although I don't know if we're actually going to even collect Triforces. And that's an insane thing to even have to think about, really. That there very possibly won't be even a point in this game where you do collect Triforces. Because that's been a fairly consistent thing amongst most of the main Zelda games. In a lot of ways, I would say that Breath of the Wild feels like somebody was trying to make a Game Boy style Zelda game, but had to put it on the Switch. Because it does feel much closer to something like Link's Awakening, where it's just outside the main narrative. And having played it over the weekend now, which that's going to create a whole problem now, because I do need to get back to Wolfenstein Old Blood, but I also kind of need to finish playing Zelda, or I'll just get backlogged on it. I may just play it on the weekends. That would be an odd twist of how to do things, but that might work. It might be worth the experiment, at least. Inherently, there's, having played it over the weekend now, it definitely feels like there's some fairly easy ways to have fixed this. What you do, first of all, is that there's a heavy focus on the slate and the abilities around the slate. So, maybe you de-emphasize some of those abilities, or you have those abilities integrate better into your default system. Zelda games have never had health regen before, so you could add health regen, and I don't think you violate anything too much from that, because most Zelda games also allowed you to actively slice grass and get rupees and hearts if you were really, really struggling. So you could eliminate a pain point there, particularly if you're going to keep the player by default at 3 hearts, which arguably you don't keep them by default at by 3 hearts. Instead, you do like you always have done. You have a dungeon that gives you a heart after a boss battle, which shrines are sorely missing that. Very rarely do you go into a shrine and have to fight anything. In fact, in the starting area, you don't fight anything at all. So, you start off Breath of the Wild in this rejuvenation chamber, which really just shows that you're the Zelda from 100 years, you're the Link from 100 years ago, and you've just lost your memories. Apparently also in the battle you've lost your nipples, is the joke I want to make, because they refuse to depict nipples. Although there's a point later where he cross-dresses into a city that only allows women in, and all the women are wearing tops, so clearly the women have breasts of some sort, whether they're nipples or not. But Link seems not to. And at a certain point, if it's a city that only allows women in, I think tops would be removed as a requirement fairly quickly, because it is also kind of a warrior race that's showing off their abs. So it does seem kind of silly. And I could definitely see when you're in that area with the women-only city and you're cross-dressing that there's potentially a little too much on that gag. It feels like once you snuck in by cross-dressing, you should have been given permission to enter the city in any clothing and any armor. So anytime you want to return to that city, you, instead of having to swap out armor and clothing, you could just wear whatever you were wearing after that first challenge of actually getting into the city and talking to the chief in charge. But yeah, I could see some parents, more conservative parents, going, why is there such an emphasis on cross-dressing? Now, there is a point in previous Zelda games where you've also cross-dressed to enter women-only cities. So it's not like that. It's never been done before. In fact, it's really just copying that, but it's copying it and making it bigger, like it's copying and making everything bigger. So I'm rambling here, but if I was going to fix Breath of the Wild, I'd start the game with equipping clothing by default. There's kind of really no reason for him to be in swim trunks or underwear when he first starts, because within the first 5 steps you find a chest with a shirt and pants and you put them on for extra defense. You might as well have just started with the shirt and pants, or had more of a tutorialized section there. And then your first goal should be to defeat a dungeon with tree branches and sticks, and at the end of that dungeon should be not the Master Sword by any means, but a sword of some ascent, and potentially there should also be a shield. So there should be one dungeon, and instead they've broken it up into 4 shrines, and I don't think that works because it's not really reinforcing the ideas and concepts enough when you just have one shrine, particularly when the 4 shrines in the starting area are all in different areas, so there's easily 20 minutes between one shrine and the next. There needed to be one dungeon, one starter dungeon with twigs, tree branches, and it doesn't have to be in a building or underground by any means, so you could have kind of easily had a forested dungeon area. And in that forested dungeon area, you could have had tree branches, you could have had torches, you could have used the tree branches to start fires, which I'm surprised to find out that yes, you can start a lot of the weapons on fire and use them like torches, but you're damaging the weapons, which is kind of insane, but in a pinch it will do. There's also elemental weapons that are fairly rare, so a fire sword can start a fire, but also you're swinging a fire sword against something you need to burn and lowering its durability, so it's not really worth it at that point either. So for the first 5 or 6 hours I was carrying one of like 6 weapon slots. I was carrying a torch, and I'm gonna say you really don't need to carry torches. So far there are 2 points where there's a blue flame that you start at a blue furnace, and you need a torch then to carry it from the furnace to another furnace that's unlit with the blue flame. And there's a whole bunch of little Chinese looking lanterns in between to set as checkpoints, but the game doesn't save every time you set a checkpoint, so you can still die and be several lanterns back. But what happens in those cases is you find a torch relatively close to that. So anywhere where you see a torch, you should look around to see if there's something that's burnable. But otherwise, you probably should drop a torch fairly quickly once you're out of an area and once you've done something with the torch. On the other hand, there is also a kokoro leaf that you use to put wind into the sails of boats, but you don't ride boats that often, but often enough that you really should probably waste a slot of your weapons with holding on to the kokoro leaf, which again, you just find the kokoro leaf instead of it being at the end of a dungeon. But yeah, the first whole section of Breath of the Wild should have a kind of forested dungeon in the middle, and it does kind of have a forested area in the middle, so if they had just kind of squeezed that a little bit bigger to turn that into a dungeon, and then eliminated some of these other areas of the starter area, that'd be fine. Have some puzzles with tree branches and starting things on fire or burning dried out thorns to get to the next place. Then there should have been a single like boss fight at the end of the dungeon, and that after defeating that boss you should have gotten a heart upgrade, a heart container upgrade, or at least 1/4 of a heart container upgrade. And that should have been the thing that would have then led you to getting your first weapon. And arguably you may even need to get a shield before you start that dungeon, so I could see there being a subquest to run around the overworld to find a shield first, before you enter that first dungeon area. And then it's a shield with a stick fighting what would be a low-level boss. Probably a low-level boss that you would then end up seeing a lot of, like a little goblin creature. And then you would start with a rusty sword, which would be fine as long as it didn't break. that did something like 4 or 5 damage. Now, inherently with Breath of the Wild, they do have this height issue, and that's where the shrine's ability and need to be underground comes from. Is that you actually cannot have in the overworld a dungeon that you can climb up to a tall tower and then paraglide into to get to the final area, even though there are similar cheats that already exist. Like the idea of being able to potentially skip an entire dungeon breaks the game too much. But I think you can probably figure ways around that by simply either having a shield, which the shields already exist over the tops of the areas. Maybe they don't want you to be able to look into the dungeons and spoil surprise, so maybe you then have actual roofs, or so you can't look in. The other thing is there are towers that are just straight up Far Cry, let's climb this tower and then reveal the land. That feels insanely wrong for a Zelda game. There should be dungeon maps, and there should be keys. I've seen one key in one shrine so far, and I bet that's the only key I ever see in the game, or one of maybe 4 or 5. So I could see a concept around finding maps to find different areas, or just talking to people to build the map bigger, or hear about certain areas. The desire to talk to a lot more NPCs than you ever have in a Zelda game before, I think, does then add the need for there to be more rewards when you do talk to people. Instead, you're getting kind of side quests and offers to collect a lot of items. It does seem like in the long run you probably should hold on to everything and not make elixirs or food products, recipes. Elixirs being the monster parts, and the insects being mixed together, food products being multiple food products being added together. And never the two should meet, otherwise you'll get a dubious food item. But that seems about the only way you end up with a dubious food item. And they don't really tell you that until later in the game, and you should just have been told that. Yeah, at the very beginning of the whole cooking element, it should have been told to not mix insects or monster parts into your food until you become better at cooking, or just not let you. Plus, when you do cook something, it's not like you have a recipe book where you can then recreate that dish. So the whole interface on the cooking is slow, which is a major reason why I don't want to engage with it, is that it is just incredibly slow. So yeah, that first area should have a dungeon. At the end of the first dungeon, you should end up with the rusty sword and shield, and eventually when you're done with that first area, maybe there's some other side quests that are 50% of the game balanced out with actually going to a dungeon. then you end up with the paraglider and can leave that first area. If you want to have the tower elements, I think you do because of the paraglider, then you probably want to put the dungeon at the top of a tower element, which is to probably say they could have just put a teleporter or an elevator to far above in the sky a dungeon, and if you put the dungeon far above in the sky above the clouds, which would be somewhat similar to Skyward Sword, then there's no way to be above them and fly into them or see what they're all about. So yeah, it would have been fairly easy to, instead of having shrines going down in the ground, to have a tower going far above in the sky. If you don't want to go higher in the sky because of Skyward Sword, you could still have the tower high up and that be the point where you paraglide to other locations, even though there really aren't enough towers for that. And then you can have a special elevator in the tower that goes far underground, and then that is just doing what shrines are doing. Now shrines give you teleportation points, but obviously you could fix Zelda a lot better by just having teleportation points for every place that is named and marked on the map, or at least every safe place that's named and marked on the map. And once you climb a tower and find those locations, you should be able just to teleport then. And until you climb that tower, you probably shouldn't be able to teleport, which that would argue that there should be more towers, which really there should be anyways. I think there's maybe 7 in the entire game, or maybe 9. So for each tower there should have been a dungeon instead of shrines, and then for the 100 shrines being consolidated down into 9 thematic dungeons with 9 bosses, each giving you a heart upgrade, which would then have given you 12 hearts at the end of the game minimum. But the game's just not doing any of that, and that's why it just doesn't feel like Zelda to me. And as a layman, armchair game developer, if I can think of ways you would have done this to make it more feel like a Zelda game, and they chose not to do that, it really just screams a little bit too much arrogance in that they can slap Zelda on anything and it will sell. And yeah, it's crazy that people love Zelda so much. Certainly, I guess when the time came out as one of the first Switch games, probably was fairly groundbreaking. It's definitely very groundbreaking from Nintendo, but it really just highlights that Nintendo has failed to ever learn how to make open world games, and they are struggling with just general basic concepts such as having grass render and frame pop in, which I've seen a little bit of that. And at certain points, having a day and night cycle doesn't make any sense in Zelda, and yet that's something that happens there. Having a temperature cycle, like clearly there should just have been a dungeon where you got an ability to climb higher when above a certain temperature instead of getting armor to do that. Or you get the armor at the end of a dungeon, and the armor helps you to withstand heat or withstand cold as elemental triggers. There really aren't enough places where withstanding heat is that big of a deal, and all of it can just be cheated by cooking foods that will resist the that you resist the heat or resist the cold. Now you can't make food or elixirs that resist both at the same time because they counter each other out, but or at least that's what I've read in the game. But yeah, fairly frequently, if you're trying to go to the very top of a mountain, which is where you want to go way more often, is because you want to be able to look around with the camera and mark things on the map. But yeah, fairly frequently you'll climb up to cold, higher areas. Very rarely will you be in the desert or in a warmer area. In fact, it's very possible that the only time you actually will be in the desert will be in the lower left-hand part of the map for one of the 4 divine beasts, and after that, never again. Let's see if we can pull this off by doing this. Which then puts these 2 here. Which then hopefully means this one. Probably didn't need to activate that one. Actually, that's going to kind of work out perfectly. Canceling one to allow the other one to actually work. I'll be darned if that did not seem to work. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, and 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And go. Yeah, I've been talking about Zelda Breath of the Wild, and I'm at most a third of the way through with the game for an hour now. And I've definitely been complaining about a lot of things, but I can't really say it's a totally crappy game. If anything, I'm still very much more upset with the tiny little controls on the Joy-Cons on the Switch, the low resolution, the kind of lack of experience in making what it would be a modern open world game on Nintendo's part. But almost at a certain point, I think they should probably lean into the idea that we don't make open world games. Nintendo probably should say, look, Zelda games, Mario games, they don't need to be open world games. We see this with Sonic Frontiers too, where people are saying, does it really need to be an open world game, or could it just be a linear experience? Ocarina of Time is technically open world for what that meant in the old days, but really all that meant was that there was 4 sections that were connected by a central open area. And I would be okay with that if the central part of the map just had a open area where you could ride horses around, and that was that. And then the rest of the game was mostly still very linear. At a certain level, that is all that Darkstalkers 2 was all about also, is that it was this pretend open world game where there was just a central area where you could ride a horse. Also, though, I would say in the Darksiders series, you can summon and unsummon your horse instantaneously, which I don't think you're going to be able to do, at least not until the very end of Zelda, which that's a slight spoiler. And I do definitely feel like the game is going to kind of continue, although if you put 100 hours into a 60-hour experience in Zelda, which is what I suspect it is, you would, I think, fairly quickly find that you're starting to run out of resources, regardless of whether you can take a picture of an item and then set that to your sensor and then use your sensor to try and find more resources. The sensors probably will find you renewable resources as far as food products, mushrooms, plants like that, but swords, specific weapons, I don't think there's a guarantee that that's going to work. I think they tried to make it work with the every 13th day is a blood red moon, and that respawns enemies that have already died for that time, but that's kind of it. If anything, that feels like that's just something they added and should have added at the end of the game to respawn enemies. But then the idea of taking pictures of specific enemies at a certain level also falls apart, because you don't have the camera ability before you've, I think, fought some kinds of enemies, but maybe not. I didn't have the camera after I fought one enemy that I randomly found, one big named character, and then I imagine that's going to turn out to be something that I'll have to back up and pay to get a picture of that one named character if I want to get a full Pokedex. But the camera kind of Pokedex idea, it's half a thought, but it's a broken thought, really. Because you end up inevitably needing to take pictures of items outside of a good point in which they visually are appealing. When I find a random item, it's almost always in a chest and a shrine. So what do I have to do? I open the chest, the item gets added to your inventory, then I have to go to my inventory, drop it on the floor of a shrine, which is a good place to take pictures, but then I'll drop several items and then I'll take pictures of them, and the pictures will look horrible. So why not just have default pictures that are already programmed in come up when we scan or take a picture of an item, instead of having custom pictures. Pokemon Snap, on the other hand, which is doing very much the same thing, is rewarding you for taking good pictures and encouraging you in a nice, slow, peaceful experience to take pictures. That's not going to be the case if you're trying to take a picture of an enemy that's charging at you. Many times I've done that, where I've gone into picture mode, tried to take a picture. It doesn't freeze time when you take a picture, which is a huge mistake. But yeah, I've tried to take a picture of it as something is attacking me, and then either gotten hit or barely gotten away with not getting hit. So yeah, it's a lot of broken systems, a lot of systems that it feels like the game started off with, I want this system, and this system in the game, and it really does not feel like the person in charge of this has been the people who were in charge with the previous Zelda games. Maybe they didn't want as much redundancy, or maybe they just wanted something completely different. And it's going to be very weird that we're potentially going to see a Breath of the Wild 2 that'll just double down in the open world and different gameplay mechanics, and that will be the new Zelda. And the idea of a throwback Zelda where dungeons specifically give you items will just become either an antiquated thing that they do on rare occasions or something they just never do again. Which that kind of effectively ruins the Zelda series without offering a replacement. Zelda was probably the right Nintendo game to go open world if Nintendo needed to go open world, but that's the big if. Like, it would make less sense for an open world Mario game. It would make a lot of sense for an open world Donkey Kong game, though. If you took the exact map layout of Donkey Kong, of Breath of the Wild, and had Donkey Kong running around, at least that would make a little bit more sense, where you're a monkey fighting other insects and animals. Plus, then you can have better logical reasons as to why this game, which has been incredibly overbalanced in such a way that you could probably cook a food that increases your maximum hearts and your stamina, and go and fight Ganon at the very beginning of the game. I've seen speedrunners do it. There's some slight tricks you have to do, but it's totally doable that you can skip 98%, 99% of the entire game if you're really good. But if you were playing as Donkey Kong and there was just no expectation of having weapons or armor upgrades, and you were instead more in an open world experience where you're just collecting bananas and spelling out donkey or rare or whatever other things that you would have seen in something like Donkey Kong Country, that could definitely make a lot more sense to be open world. Plus, if you really messed up making a Donkey Kong Country open world game, you're not going to upset that many people. And the Chinese element of it, and I can only describe it as Chinese, as someone who is a Japanophile to a certain level and does feel like they understand a certain amount of the difference between Chinese and Japanese. The only way that Breath of the Wild can feel Chinese is if it is, feel Japanese, as if it is just heavily relying on like ancient Buddhist Chinese mythology, which none of the other games felt like that. The story that I heard, and I'll just leave it at that, is that the reason why Shinzo Abe was assassinated in the real world is because Shinzo Abe's grandfather, who founded this kind of regressive faction inside the Chinese, the Japanese government, that is just attempting to bring everything back to the glory days of World War II and denies any war crimes at all. That was effectively founded by Shinzo Abe's grandfather, and at a certain point, he also, the Shinzo Abe's grandfather, this is the story I heard, founded one of the cults in Japan and kind of more in Korea. I assume that is the Happy Sunshine cult. I think that's what it's called. And the assassin's mother had joined that cult and given the cult like all of her life savings. So it seems like this is straight up a revenge. The assassination was revenge for against the grandfather, the grandson, for what the grandfather's doing. Although in all fairness, Shinzo Abe was definitely following in the grandfather's footsteps and just continuing to push the same elements. And there is definitely some potential nastiness around the idea that even now that group inside of the Japanese that group inside the Japanese ruling party is still funding the cult in Korea, in particular, to act as a kind of destabilizing force in Korea, and possibly funding the cult in Japan to act as a destabilizing force in Japan somewhat too. So, what does that have anything to do with Breath of the Wild? My point there is that it really would have had to have been somebody who's fairly old and pining for the glory days of Chinese narrative to come up with Breath of the Wild, the way it's showing things, the way it's depicting things, the story being told on scrolls. There's just some kind of deep historic Chinese nationalism, which might be deep historic Japanese nationalism narrative. It feels like somebody had that when they made Breath of the Wild, and that's just not something that we've seen in any of the previous Zelda games. And if that was going to be part of the narrative, it's not like it's been censored out in previous games. Yeah, I just don't feel like Wind Waker or Skyward Sword or any of that has been censoring out Chinese or Japanese elements so much so that it truly was a Chinese or Japanese version of the games. Like, the local Japanese releases of Zelda games don't have incredibly different narratives or stories. And when you look at things like Majora's Mask, which is just crazy, that one doesn't feel like that is going in that direction. I wouldn't be surprised if we do find that Breath of the Wild's narrative in particular gets dropped for a more traditional adventure game with elves. If anything, Zelda games are closer to like Lord of the Rings type stories with elves and fairies and things like that. It is much more of a central or Western European or Central European narratives. Like trolls, goblins, elves, fairies, all of those elements. Definitely not things that would have been in a Chinese or Japanese centric elements. And it doesn't feel like it's even trying to pander to China, although maybe there was an attempt to pander to China there, because there's plenty of skeletons, maybe not humanoid skeletons, but there are skeleton creatures in the Zelda games, so in Breath of the Wild, so you would think that that would go away. And then you're still not telling a story about like Goku or the Monkey King, and you're still not telling a story about the like 13 Romance of the Three Kingdoms or anything like that. And so if you really were going to try and pander to China, you would have to pander a lot harder to even have a chance. You'd still probably fail. I just don't. And if you, I guess if you actually think about the timing there, the odds that Nintendo was going to even be able to sell the Switch in China at the time were fairly low. So pandering to China doesn't make a lot of sense. So yeah, it just kind of comes off odd. It just feels like there was an odd amount of decisions made, and just an odd person put in charge who then came out with a list of these are all the features we want in an open world game, and it comes off much more like a Skyrim game than it probably should. If anything, it is very much falling under that same category of feeling like Skyrim. Oh, I didn't realize that would work, because it doesn't. But I guess since I've started playing it, I will power through it on the weekends. This is going to be an awkward weekend, and I've been talking about this for a long time, so I guess I did have a lot to say. Unfortunately, I can't put any footage up. I don't have the equipment to capture video outside of a Switch. Plus, it wouldn't matter anyways, because even if I was constantly talking, which I really wouldn't have been in the shape to do that anyways, you would still get Content ID claimed by Nintendo, because they don't believe in fair use. So yeah, I can't capture footage of it, even small snippets for some kind of like video essay that would take a lot more work than I'm willing to do, would get Content ID'd. Even potentially just talking about it in its own separate video labeled Zelda Breath of the Wild review might get falsely Content ID claimed. Send that to the graveyard. Activate that. Send that to the graveyard. Activate that. Yeah, it is going to be a weird week though, because all of the stuff I have bought from Amazon Prime Day will start showing up on Tuesday and Wednesday, which means there's more reasons why I would potentially not get around to playing. I've also noticeably dropped the ball, like, on the daily PC games. Inherently, yeah. So I'll be busy, and I'm losing my train of thought here, and we've covered no news at all, so I need to move forward. Yeah. Okay, let's see. Has any of the Spicy Horse games been relisted? No. BioWare has put out an update here for Star Wars The Old Republic. Apparently they're adding daily mission arcs, new challenge operations for 18 players, improvements to weapons and outfitter system, key revelations. Alright, well, let's do this. Well, I might save the day. So yeah, Star Wars The Old Republic is working on it. Oh, what I was going to say is, yeah, I have like 3 games that I've picked over probably 4 or 5 days that could have been PC game, daily PC games. So I think that is probably a case where we would, I'll probably drop down to not doing it on the weekends, even though I'm calling it daily PC games, because I just can't think of a better name. But yeah, I'll probably drop it down and try to go a little bit further ahead, because it does feel like there will be just some droughts that happen around that. It is just this extra bit of work that I'm going to have to find extra time for. Alright, come on. See, when that's destroyed, alluring mirror split should summon another one. That may not matter too much unless he can merge them together, which I think is what that does. Excuse me. Let's see. Video Games Chronicles says the Lego Atari 2600 will include cartridges that can be turned into vignettes vignettes of Asteroid's Adventure and Centipede are included in the set. So the Atari 2600 here as a device, which this is probably not what it's actually going to look like when made out of Lego, is not very impressive, particularly if you've never had one before. Nor are the games visually that impressive. So in the NES with TV set, there is a vignette type experience, if vignette's the right word to use there, where you can see Mario, and the Mario runs around a World 1-1 of Super Mario Brothers. And I thought at some point they would have put out some kind of expansions for that NES set, where you would have gotten a cartridge for like $40 or $50 at most, and then with the cartridge there would have been a way to change what was on the TV. Noticeably, the Atari 2600 does not include a TV, so hopefully it would be a lot cheaper than the, I believe it was $250 NES set, but it's gonna not offer that much, really. I wouldn't be surprised if these vignettes really are just square pictures. I wouldn't be surprised if they don't really connect or work with the TV that already exists. There is definitely a thought that that this is because the Atari 2600 is coming out, we're not getting a Super NES or a GameCube or a Nintendo 64 out of Lego, or a Game Boy out of Lego instead, which people would have much preferred any of those over an Atari. Which at a certain level that's probably a good thing, though, because Lego has just raised their prices and they're just being greedy, and now is the time to boycott them, but now is also the time that they've decided to relist a lot of the old sets that you would have potentially played with as a kid if you were 30 or 40 at this point. But I'm not sure you even really want those old sets, like the Lego Castle sets. It's hardly like the first generation Lego building system before minifigs were a thing. It's still all stuff that was early days of the minifig scale generation, which we're still in, and they'll probably stick to that minifig scale and minifigs as an element. It'd be hard to believe that they would actually get away from minifigs. Even the Lego Friends dolls were crazy when they came out. But yeah, it now is definitely more the time to boycott Lego than buy Lego. If we could potentially convince them to get rid of the current leader or go on a different path, that would probably be appreciated. Moving on, the God of War Ragnarok Jotnar Edition listings flood eBay after a swift sellout in the US, which, yeah, that inherently doesn't mean any of them are actually selling on eBay, but it shows that a lot of people are claiming that they have some to sell on eBay. The UK government says the game industry must act on loot boxes or face legislation, which is effectively saying we're not going to do anything at the moment. A working group will be formed to develop industry-led measures to protect players, which that's all the ESA and the ESRB is, and at a certain point it might be, from a United States and Americans perspective, might be applauded to say less government control, but probably not. Particularly when you're talking about things that are actively targeting kids. I think there probably should be more of a European style tight rein and control over all of that. And so, yeah, I think loot box legislation would be something that would be fairly easy to implement, to say no loot boxes or microtransactions at all for under 13. Any game targeting the age of under 13. Age verification via credit card for the age over 18 for any games that have smoking or alcohol use or gambling mechanics other than loot boxes, or direct casino alliterations or comparisons. We definitely need some kind of age verification in general for people even under 13. And I guess the best way to do that would be to say parents need to through their credit cards, be able to age verify their age, and then verify some kid with some unconnected number, like a one-time passcode. In fact, I'm kind of shocked that some kind of system like that doesn't exist, where you're requiring a parent to verify through a credit card that they are over a certain age, and then when they verify they are over a certain age, they give a one-time permission slip passcode to that specific game company and that specific program. Yeah, that'd actually be very good. But they're not doing anything like that. Instead, the UK is being far too crazy and lenient for the UK. Moving on, Video Games Chronicle says CD Projekt stock has fallen over 75% since Cyberpunk 2077's release. And I wouldn't really call this the point where you should buy as far as CD Projekt Red's, because it's not like they have another game that's coming out anytime soon. So the turnaround probably wouldn't happen anytime soon. This guy's pointing the other way. Come to see. Come to look at it. So I'm going quiet here. Not sure what has happened here as far as my program here. Losing, obviously. There we go. Of course, that's too big. Yeah, I'm just going quiet here, trying to figure out what went wrong with Video Games Chronicle now that the pages are proper. Moving on, Netflix's Resident Evil series currently has one of the lowest audience scores. Shows a 22% audience rating on Rotten Tomatoes. I definitely feel like there is a level of bad, unrelatable writing that I have seen has been criticized. But I haven't looked at it. I probably will check it out, even knowing that the reviews are pretty bad. Although I still haven't even gotten to like the second season of Witcher on Netflix, so I'm not really that interested in watching video game based shows. If anything, Capcom should be applauded for their ability to sell a series that is honestly just not that sellable. I don't know any other way to really put it there. It's just always been a case where the Resident Evil series is this goofy, silly experience, and that goofy, silly experience is not going to translate well to live action and realistic. It can translate maybe decently enough for a movie, and then you can have another goofy movie in a couple years. Honestly, making a horror serialized TV show is probably a mistake in the first place, because I'm not sure there's a single horror serialized TV show that succeeded, with the exception of The Walking Dead. And then you really have to get down to the question about, is The Walking Dead a show that succeeds because of the horror, or is it a show that succeeds because of the writing and the people involved? Yeah, I don't know what went wrong here, but Warframe Studio announces Soulframe, a new MMORPG, according to Video Games Chronicles. I'll just leave that. Unity's CEO promises to do better after calling developers not prioritizing monetizations effing Indians. My choice of word was crude. I am sorry. So immediately an apology there. Probably not enough of an apology for most. EA is patenting a way to generate content based on playstyle. Players' personas will be identified and used for ads and actual in-game content. If anything, this seems like they're just patenting a very general idea to have more loot boxes. Destroying that really won't do anything. That definitely does not feel like a good thing in the long run. Let's see. PlayStation owners can get Stray for free this week, even without a paid PlayStation Plus subscription. Sony has quietly added a 7-day trial offer. So if you got the 7-day trial, you probably get locked in to being charged after the 7 days. But getting it right now would get you Stray for free. And it does potentially feel like, oh darn it, that was a mistake. That was a big mistake. It does seem like people might be liking Stray. I haven't seen the full reviews yet, but it does seem like there's more talk around that. Video Games Chronicle says that Microsoft's Activision buyout could be approved by the FTC as soon as next month, which honestly, I feel like they've already said that once before, and that you're just going to say as soon as point A, point B, because there's no point in being right or wrong. You can just speculate to your heart's content forever. Only thing here is we don't want to activate our ability. Let's see. New Xbox Game Pass titles for console and PC and cloud have been announced. July's upcoming games include Dusk Falls, Watch Dogs 2, and MotoGP 22 and more, which seems like this is a fairly long list, so I'll just say check it out if you're interested on Video Games Chronicle. Nintendo's delayed EU Xenoblade Chronicles 3 Collector's Edition pre-orders until after release, which is going to irritate everybody who pre-ordered the Collector's Editions, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's actual unforeseen logistical challenges with the pandemic and all. There is a Xenoblade Chronicles 3 or 2 crossover in Zelda Breath of the Wild, and it's mentioned in the side mission menu, but it's not really mentioned anywhere else. It really feels like when you launch the game, although Nintendo is doing a weird thing with launching games anyways, but it does feel like there should have been a bit more of a notification there instead of potentially hiding it down the news channel. Where my eyes would just glass over on any notification in the news channel. Nintendo is really just like breaking the idea of having menus or having start screens at all. Like they at least for their own first party title games, you really in Pokemon Snap do just hit start and get going. You do just hit start and play Zelda Breath of the Wild, or you don't even hit start, you just hit the A button, which at a certain level that is what I want to see. Is I want to see all the options hidden in a universal API, and instead of having a main menu. I don't know how you get that to work on PC. But it probably wouldn't be too hard for Steam to implement something like that where options are universal. I don't really see a need to hang out on the main menu, although that does eliminate ways in which you would it eliminates ways in which you would have extras and collectibles and things like that. And I've seen in the past Nintendo games then have to integrate collectibles and extras directly into the game, and it feels a little fourth wall breaking and silly. So maybe there is some value in having a main menu. Nintendo also trying to get rid of difficulty settings. There are no difficulty settings in Breath of the Wild, and I do feel like that's probably part of the problem there, where it would have been beneficial after dying twice in a row if you could get an extra heart or two, just so the game would take some pity on you. Moving on, Xbox veteran Jerry Hook is leading a new development studio for Chinese NetEase. Former 343 Industries, Rocksteady, and software developers, and id Software developers on board at the Seattle studio. There is something I think very odd around the way that you actually do move up the ladder in video game development terms more than you publicly see that happen in pretty much any other industry. But it does feel like while game developers work hard and probably earn how much they're getting paid, if not more, it does feel like they also are still getting paid a little too much, to the point where they can go and spin off their own companies and get angel investors because they're in California, and get their friends to invest in new companies. Although in this case, NetEase being your friend is an odd way to look at that, but that's kind of the case. I wouldn't be surprised if these are just names that people have heard of, thus NetEase hired them to be the figureheads of their company that NetEase is going to run, however NetEase is going to run it. And at a certain point, it really doesn't make a lot of sense to be promoted to management when you're a highly skilled associate game programmer. I think that's where a lot of the egos and a lot of the problems come from. I'd much prefer to have somebody like Randy Pitchford, who I don't believe was ever really a programmer, and if he was, he didn't do much. I'd much prefer there to be just idiot managers in charge over having a programmer stop programming to then be the producer and developer. When you look at most of the developments, most of the Japanese developed games, the people in charge, the producers, just the directors, I think aren't really the programmers or the artists there. It certainly doesn't make a lot of sense in other industries. Like you wouldn't have a highly skilled or good factory worker that's working to assemble cars. You wouldn't tell that person that, yeah, you're now going to be the person in charge of running the other factory workers. Right. Let's do this. Toss this. Summon this one. That one doesn't do anything. Summon this one. That one would summon a new card, I believe. Just playing a lot of cards here. Let's see this one. I think. Yep, I'd have to have a third Zodiac card for that one to have done anything, which is whatever. So much for relinquished. We'll go ahead and toss this and get rid of relinquished. And we'll go ahead and activate this effect to toss this one. Toss this one. Add this one to the hand. And just wait for him to concede. 2 more levels and we'll be at the end. And we're slowly trying to make it to platinum tier. But unfortunately, I think we've gone another 2 hours here, and I've just kind of rambled on and not even done any real progress. So let's just clear all of this. Oddly, I'm not making a lot of progress as far as declaring an attack. I have a new Duel live. There was something in this notification here, which is just, I guess, a note. That's about all to say there, I guess. We can get some more gems, 20 gems, and some more crafting points. Incredibly small amounts. This ends in 42 days, so I do need to have 600 gems, which that really won't be a problem. And we'll not making enough progress as far as opening the legacy cards. Yep. Really should open about 30, I think, for a while. Still getting decent amounts of new cards also. But again, like I said at the beginning of the stream, you just don't have time to really read these cards. Even if you were not as distracted as I am, it's just, it's too much walls of text. Not enough labels and symbols. that would mean the same thing. The game definitely needs more key phrases. Alright, well, 30 bonus packs will get us a little bit further down that path. But if we go here, dismantle all extra cards, 30 extra cards, it's just going to give us a few hundred normal and rare crafting points and not a single super rare, ultra rare. Which I think really does point out that you are just, with the legacy packs, going to get a whole bunch of you're going to get a whole bunch of the normal and rares and never get any super rares or ultra rares. Video Games Chronicles says Switch and mobile games Star Wars Hunters has been delayed again, which it was originally announced in February 2021 and I don't even remember it. So I'll just leave it at that. And then our last Video Games Chronicles article here is FIFA 23 Ultimate Edition includes the franchise's first ever female global cover star. Chelsea's Sam Kerr will appear alongside PSG's Kylian Mbappe on the box. This is funny because I was watching Ted Lasso and wondering if there are female soccer players in the leagues, or can be, because I know in the United States American football has had like one female football player in its entire history. But if she is playing for Chelsea, the question would be, still, is she playing for Chelsea's female team, or have at least the league, the football league that she's in, decided to combine the genders. Inherently, I could see a decent argument for not desegregating the leagues. It's not going to be inherently fair on the females, but this has always been the positive sexism argument. But I guess soccer is about running, soccer is about kicking with accuracy and kicking with power. It is possible always that there will be standout professionals, female players that can run, kick with power, kick with accuracy, or that they could play a more line back, defensive, whatever that even means in soccer position, and that they're just really good at passing. It definitely feels like that is more likely to happen in American football, where American football is about actually just brutal aggression and headbutting each other and hurting each other as much as possible. Soccer is also a lot around hurting the other player. We have to admit that, or players faking that they've been hurt. That is a big part of soccer, and it's a bad part of soccer, frankly. So I'm not sure how soccer fans are going to feel. Soccer is also incredibly popular in a lot of the Middle Eastern countries where women don't have equal rights. So that there's a point there, certainly, as far as that. So I wouldn't be surprised if it is still fairly segregated soccer games. And the one American football player that did make it to the NFL or college league or whatever, she really hasn't blown up the charts or anything like that. It really does feel like if we were going to start to see a lot of females in American football, it would be because a lot of them started to transition from male to female late in life after they've already grown the muscle mass and hit puberty. And even that is highly unlikely to happen because there's just so much like homophobia amongst NFL players in particular, I would have to assume is the case. Moving on, Gematsu has an article. 505 Games parent company, Digital Brothers, establishes a new publishing label called Hook, which their lineup is Kingdom of the Dead, Mad Shot by Overflow, Unholy by Duality Games, and then other undisclosed projects, which, yeah, of course I don't recognize any of these, but three of these are listed on Steam, so we could do our own research here. Unholy looks like a horror game. It could be something horror stealth game, potentially. Okay. Mad Shot looks like it is a platforming shooter game with maybe some power-ups, which is in early access at the moment, but on my fall list. And then Kingdom of the Dead looks like probably too stylized of a game for me to be interested in it, even though people are rating it very positively. Let's see. Sony Interactive Entertainment has completed its acquisition of Bungie, according to Gematsu, and Ghost of Tsushima sales have topped 9.73 million. Okay, so now the big wall of games that have come out is really where I'm going to start to struggle, particularly since we're still also looking at adult games, which then I'm going to have to quickly come over here and quickly really won't even do anything because I have it programmed to fade and transition and not do a jump cut anyways. I just realized that. That's something that I want to probably just keep an eye on it for this weekend and this next week and maybe next weekend, and then be done with that and just stop opening adult games. What I want to also keep an eye out for here is how many adult games came out over the weekend, because we wrapped up fairly late, I think, on last Friday, so anything that would have come out Saturday or Sunday as far as adult games would have been missed, but still would have been in that weekend window. Only things that came out specifically on the 18th would be things that were released outside of the weekend. Super Kenny here has a game, though. Does not look interesting. My trainer is a Futanari, which is Dick Girl. Futanari as a term, though, really does mean Dick Girl. It doesn't mean transgender person. It means closer to hermaphrodite, who has both, usually has female genitalia, lower genitalia, and a male genitalia, and has breasts. And you can definitely see in this case that there are breasts here. Oddly, though, this game, being labeled adult only, doesn't really have any screenshots that are offensive, even though it is in the adult section. It's a English visual novel, and it looks like a very low-effort English visual novel looking at the background images. That came out on Sunday. And so, chronologically, unless we're going backwards in time, which we probably are, that we already have been told that there really aren't any games that have come out on this Monday. Yakuza Undisputed here doesn't look like anything. Let's see, Modern Fantasy doesn't look like anything. Creature Zone VR. I wish there was a way to get this to kind of jump through these pictures a little bit faster, but honestly I'm asking for the code to be changed there to accommodate somebody who is much more fast-paced and random and ADHD than a normal human would be. I'd like it to run 2.5 times speed. Honestly, it would be better if they were just all on the screen at the same time. This system's not great as far as just having an infinite scroll of thumbnails that should be higher up as a main focus. This is probably nothing looking at the text. Looks like it's trying to be a kid-friendly game. Elysius. Some kind of action RPG it claims to be. I kind of like this low polygon look, but I'm not seeing a real game here. Yeah, we have another adult game, 69, and Duel Hot. I definitely am seeing, now that I'm seeing these adult only games, being very much around name tagging, throwing in 69, throwing in the phrase hot. The game itself is one elf girl. Here we'll briefly show. And match games. And that came out on the 18th. So that actually did come out on Monday. Maybe early in the morning, maybe late in the evening. Games in VR. Seems to be a bunch of mini games in VR. Trying to be its own separate platform on Steam. Loplight here might be something, so I'll give it a follow. Yep. I really think I probably am going to devolve down to just saying something is follow worthy, and then the vast majority of the games will just be reevaluated from the follow lists instead of being initially evaluated earlier on. So we've seen 2 adult games so far, and then the question comes down to, will any of them actually be games that I'm going to give this a follow. Actually, I'm going to take the follow off, because if they're putting as a sales point that it's been not optimized and it's been terribly coded, I don't believe you're going to get anything better than that. I think you're just accepting defeat to start with. This Jam Gods is not visually polished enough, even though I would love an NBA Jam game. Yeah, we're still not really seeing any Eastern anime style adult games over the weekend. It does feel like there are Western games and Western adult games that are being treated differently than the Eastern adult games. And even at that, we're only seeing a small number of adult games come out anyways, where it definitely feels like you could be getting 2, 3, 5, 10 adult games every single day. And I could definitely see a case where Steam might be limiting the number of games you can list or publish in a time period, and that limit is just fairly high. But I mean, it really has to be a different limit for adult games than it would be for other games, because I definitely have seen companies, publishers like Sock Pop, put out 2-3 games in a day. There's really no reason for that. We're still seeing a ton of garbage games. So, of what I just put on the fall list, have I closed something that should have been a spotlight? Very possibly I have. So I gotta remind myself not to do that. This one looks like this might be good, although it is a VR game, so I would toss it for that reason. But I really am just quickly tossing a ton of games, and honestly, I am embracing the idea of most games not requiring any commentary, because there are definitely a lot of games here that just don't deserve the commentary. And at a certain point, I may just have to embrace coming soon. Honestly, that makes a lot of sense, because if I did embrace coming soon games, then I can potentially put out things earlier and earlier, and I really do need more things scheduled. This PC Virtual Lab as a concept should probably exist. In its implementation, it looks a little too rough, but yeah, the general idea of getting a basic education as far as building PCs does appeal. Yeah, we have another adult game, Furry Orgasm, which I don't know if you fully put that under the category of they say it's a 2D puzzle game, but I'm not even seeing the gameplay at all. I'm just seeing a bunch of screenshots of naked furry creatures. Yeah, I don't know if that really comes under the category of even a Western game as much as it is a Western fetish game, or just a fetish game in general. And at a certain point, I guess moe and anime is a fetish in itself. So they probably should be on several levels. This game also is labeled as coming soon, so it is very possible that a lot of these adult games get labeled as coming soon, but actually never get released. So how would I really be able to test for that? I don't know. But I definitely figure I need to program this better, because if it says coming soon, which is a phrase that we could search for, coming soon, this item is not yet available. If we find that on a page, then my macro should just close the page at that point. That will save me a considerable amount of time. Yep. We have another puzzle game. We have about 5 more games to look at. Wings VR. Me. VR Drugs Jigsaw Puzzle. Video Horror Society. Maggie the Magnet. One more game. And then Trash Bomber. That doesn't look that good. At a certain point, I also need to rebalance out how long I'm going to play versus how long I'm going to do video game news, because these streams are getting shorter, which probably is a good thing. I never really wanted them to get to 3 hours, but I'm also not really finishing the daily missions, so I probably do need to play a little bit more, but whatever. I also probably am going to play Zelda Breath of the Wild after Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I never get around to recording that much content on the day I stream anyways, so just taking a day off and stopping talking while still playing a Nintendo game or something as a side quest, as a side game, makes a lot of sense. Let's see, we had already talked about the gender expression tools in World of Warcraft. Not too many people went the get woke, go broke aspect of that, but enough people did, I'm sure. And I think World of Warcraft has already made enough changes that either you're committed to World of Warcraft no matter what they do, or you're out. We don't need to cover the acquisition of Bungie again. Let's see, Mediatronic races to correct accidental Fall Guys in-app purchases after they initially refused to refund people. The Last of Us Part 2 co-writer Josh Schreier, no, that's not Schreier, Josh Shearer, is leaving Naughty Dog after 21 years, which, okay, he's getting a co-writer credit, which anytime you have a co-writer credit in a video game, that probably implies that there's been some problems there. And so now retroactively I'd put my tinfoil hat on and suspect that he was not in a happy place with Naughty Dog. He may have only written part of Last of Us Part 2, and then they brought in another writer to rewrite him or finish the project. That would be my tinfoil hat theory. People not particularly happy with Last of Us Part 2's story, and it doesn't really leave you in a good position for Last of Us Part 3. So I bet there's very little for him to hold on to as far as hope with the Last of Us series. It is also possible that they're not working on The Last of Us Part 3 or any other games, and so they have nothing for him to do. Leaving a company after 21 years, though, is also not an insane thing. Like, it's only crazy when we hear stories of somebody leaving a company after 6 months or a year. 21 years is more than enough to build up a nice nest egg, potentially get a pension, or 2 or 3. I don't know how many video game companies actually have pensions. Probably none, because none of them have unions, and unions usually get your pensions. But yeah, I don't suspect that he's just retiring. He may claim that he is, but I also wouldn't be surprised if he gets hired by somebody else and starts working on something else. We already talked about Hook as a new publishing division. Here's GameDevelopers.com's turn on this. UK government won't regulate loot boxes, wants developers to police themselves. The quote here is, it would be premature to take legislation action without first pursuing enhanced industry-led measurements to deliver protections for children, which is to say we're not going to do anything. It's not premature at all, though, because this is a problem of the game developer's own creation. They made the loot boxes in the first place, so you know the intentions and actions are bad on the behalf of the game industry. As far as loot boxes are concerned, you don't have to put on this false premise to say, well, this guy stabbed this other guy, but it would be premature to arrest the guy for stabbing the other guy. We should first see if he's going to actually pull out the knife himself and then sew him back up and perform surgery. It's like, that's a ridiculous argument, and my analogy there is not that wrong. Like, they created loot boxes. Their intention was to target kids. Their intention was to make as much money above all else. And now the idea that their intention would be to do anything other than to drag their feet and pretend like they're working to stop loot boxes targeting children is going to be laughable. The threat of censorship from the UK government has definitely been weakened here. It still may exist, but if anything, it feels like they've just given the green light to continue doing what they were doing, or do slightly better but not significantly better. And loot boxes, inherently, we need to separate the arguments between loot boxes are bad for kids versus loot boxes are bad for everybody. Gambling is bad for everybody. It probably should be illegal in all forms and factors. Nobody benefits from it individually. Only criminal organizations and big corporations, which are, what's the difference really, in a lot of cases, benefit from gambling. Loot boxes should be not allowed for anybody. The building of systems to make people unhappy and desire more and spend more, that general concept, that general capitalism, whether you call it late stage capitalism or not, that is what's the problem. Making people desire things they don't actually need and waste their hard-earned money on things they don't need. That needs to be tightly curbed and legislated. And particularly as we're moving towards a global recession, that is definitely something we should look at, and we should try to get laws passed in every country to curb advertising, curb growing discontent amongst the populace. If another government was growing as much discontent among the populace as Coca-Cola does to the American citizens, as far as you need Coke, you need to drink Coke, they would be classified a terrorist organization, or we would be in a Cold War with that country. But because it's Coca-Cola, a corporation, they're perfectly fine to make people discontent with water. But yeah, we really should pass those laws as we're going into a global recession, and we should probably rush to do that before we potentially have global warming kill off massive amounts of people in giant heat waves, at which point resources may spring back. If there was half as many people on the planet, which there very well might be, even less than that, then resources will start spiking back up. So we should learn to make do through famine when we so we can keep those lessons in a potential feast. That way we have resources saved up for a next generation after the fact. Otherwise, what's going to happen is you're going to have a bunch of people discontent with a global recession and a Great Depression type experience, and then they're going to come out of that depression as soon as there's even a slight light at the end of the tunnel and spend ridiculous amounts of money. It is very possible we'll see a generation unlike the previous Great Depression generation that spent the rest of their life never spending a dime, always saving, always knowing that the next depression could happen. It may be very much that we have a generation that comes out of a small depression and spends all their money as soon as they feel like that they're out of the depression, and it just leads back into a depression. Of course, I'm talking economics here, and that really doesn't matter that much to video games, because all of that is unnecessary as far as video games. But they are fun, and they do keep people entertained for a long amount of time. Let's see. Ghost of Tsushima turns 2 years old and sells nearly 10 million copies. They're rounding up. Game developer. And then Unity CEO John Riccitiello is sorry for calling devs effing idiots and regrets using crude language. Again, from GameDeveloper.com. Right. And then we've got some follow list cleanup, which I'll potentially need to reevaluate the follow list cleanup also. This game has no reviews, and so it's not relevant. If I put anything on the wish list, I'll need to pull out the control. This game needs more time. There you go, Siberia, the World Before, which is another game in the Siberia series. I'll add that to the wish list since it's rated very positively. Yep, this Siberia series is a difficult one to wrap my head around, certainly. Swords and magic and stuff. It's a single player game with online co-op. Yeah, this one doesn't look good enough. Still early access from 2020 also. Swordbreak Origins needs more time. Sword Reverie has a VR adventure in early access, needs more time. You have a kind of flat anime visual novel elements and then polygon 3D elements in VR. That's going to feel weird, I think, but people seem to be liking it. Sword Princess and multi visual novel. Yeah, I don't think that there's enough of a game here. Play, and $25 seems like quite a lot. It does have full audio, it claims to. Gender flipped world. I don't think changes enough there. So we'll say no to that. Switchball puzzle platformer. Yeah. I wonder if there is a way to fade out when a tab closes and fade in. That would be cross-fading tabs. Switchball puzzle platformer. There might be something here, but do I want to play this? These used to be kind of all the rage for a brief time there, where you'd have these kind of physics type based games. Is that meme public domain with the internet kid? It might be, because I think it was part of a PSA like thing. No, this doesn't look bad. If I was going to play something like Glover, it would make sense to have something like this to say, here, not a lot of games have tried to copy Glover, but here's one that did, and probably is doing a better job on it. Sweet Surrender VR looks could, but it's VR, so I'll leave it on that point. Sweet collector. I'll leave that and give it more time, although it's running out of time fairly quickly to be relevant. And Swarm City Zombie Evolved. Yeah, might be something to this, so I'll put it on the wish list. Although, I really shouldn't be saying there might be something to it. I should make a hard determination. Yeah, I'll put it on the wish list. I'm potentially here getting too generous with what gets onto the wish list and what doesn't. And as such, I probably should reconsider that. Okay, let me go now back to my Twitter feed and look at the 37 new tweets, and then that'll be it for news in today's stream. Video Games Chronicle has a tweet here. PlayStation has announced that it plans to acquire the esports tournament platform Repeat.gg, which we've yet to see it be we've really yet to see it become a case where any publisher has also succeeded in owning a esports tournament, or in a platform maker like Sony has owned a esports platform tournament and it really succeeded. If anything, it feels like there's just a lot of people here that are very behind the times when they thought esports was going to be the next big thing. And so maybe maybe now is the time to potentially buy esports platforms if they have any value in them at all, because you're getting them cheap and you're hoping that the pandemic ends enough that people start going back to playing esports. Let's see. This feels like old news, but apparently Bungie has sued a Destiny 2 streamer who has been accused of cheating, fraud, and harassment. Maybe this is a different lawsuit. Although at a certain point it's very possibly just going to become a mandated it is very possible that it's going to become a commonplace thing where you're suing your customers or you're suing cheaters and harassers. Although, what are you really suing them for? That's the thing, is it's always been the question of what are they actually doing illegal and what laws are you potentially trying to create to say that it's illegal. Like, the last thing we want to see is a bunch of 10-year-old edgelords getting thrown into court because they're being sued for saying mean things online, or being accused of cheating, or because they did cheat. Usually the punishment of just getting banned from the game is big enough. And suing people because you can't stop people from creating new accounts or finding ways around being banned is not the way to fix the fact that your system is broken and people are finding ways to make new accounts and get around bans. Inscription for the PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5 launches August 30th. Also, I'm still scrolling down. That's probably not it. Like, Here you can see OpenCritic saying that the game Stray is getting the mighty review rating, OpenCritic rating, a mighty 84% of top critics it's getting an 84 amongst the top critics. It's getting a 92% of critics recommending it. So very high numbers for a game that looks like it could have been very weird and niche kind of nothing game. Yeah, but I think that's probably the last bit of news. Yeah. I don't think we have anything else to really talk about, so we will call that a stream. As always, I ask you to like, share, subscribe, comment, and watch every second of my videos. If you want to friend or follow me on any social media sites, there's a whole bunch of links down below. And if you want to support me further, there's a link to Patreon, or you can friend me on Steam and gift me a gift card or buy me anything off my wish list. Thank you for watching. Have a good evening.